Hi, this presentation is on Kohlberg's theory of moral development. In the past presentations, we have discussed about Erik Erikson's theory and also Sullivan's theory of interpersonal development. So today we will talk about the theory of moral development. As always, first I will talk about the theorist himself, that is Lawrence Kohlberg. So Lawrence Kohlberg was born in 1927 in Bronxville, New York. So he was born in a wealthy family. His father was an entrepreneur and his mother was a chemist. Even though he was born in a wealthy family, he displayed an early concern for welfare of others. When Kohlberg was young, his parents separated. He was one among the four children of his parents. So in the earlier days, they used to rotate from one parent to the other so that they can spend time with both of them. So upon his graduation from Phillips, which was an elite school, he enlisted as an engineer on a carrier ship during World War II. So Kohlberg and his compatriots were successful in smuggling Jews from Europe to Palestine. So while he was doing this, he was captured by the British Army, but he and his friends were able to escape. And he spent some of his time in a Palestinian kibbutz, which affected his theory a lot, and which also laid the foundation of his theory of moral development. So this illustration of a theorist's personal choices in regard to a moral decision must have surely impacted his later work and the direction of his scholarship. So once Kohlberg returned from Israel in 1948, he started going to grad school and he completed his bachelor's degree in 1 year. Later, he got interested in psychology and started his studies for his doctoral degree in psychology, which he completed from University of Chicago in 1958. So during his doctoral education at Chicago, Kohlberg grew increasingly fascinated by the cognitive development work proposed by Swiss theorist Jean Piaget, and focused his efforts on the moral development of children for his dissertation. In 1968, Kohlberg accepted a position at Harvard University where he taught both education and social psychology, a true melding of his interest in psychology, moral development, and social justice. So during the time he spent in Israel, he was stunned by the advanced moral development of the youths he met that had journeyed the kibbutz. So before coming to America in 1948, Kohlberg spent some time in Israel where he lived in an Israeli kibbutz. So kibbutz is a community which is typically a farm where the people living in that community are mainly farmers, and they work on the land and they grow plants and they have high moral values. So Kohlberg was so influenced by them that he also started advocating non-violence and he stopped fighting in the war. Ultimately, he returned to America in 1948 and then started studying for his bachelor's and doctoral degree. But the life he lived in the kibbutz was always in his mind, and later this played an important role when he was working on the development of his theory. In 1971, Kohlberg contracted a tropical disease which persisted for 16 years. He got a parasitic infection and he used to get severe abdominal pain. On January 19, 1987, Kohlberg took a one-day leave of absence from the hospital where he was being treated for the illness and drove himself to the coast and drowned himself. His body was found a week later, and his colleagues later published his work. So now let's talk about Kohlberg's theory of moral development. So before going into the details of the theory itself, there are three things which we should know. The first thing is morality. So morality is a set of values and beliefs about codes of behavior that conform to those shared by others in a society, or the requirements necessary for people to live together in a society. The second important thing that we should know before going into the theory is moral behavior. So moral behavior is the way a person perceives those requirements and responds to them. The third is moral development. So moral development is the pattern of change in moral behavior with age. So morality is a set of values which is required if you have to live in a society. Moral behavior is how you're going to perceive those requirements to live in that society. And moral development is how your morality changes with age. Now we are ready to move on to the theory of moral development. So as we talked earlier, Kohlberg's theory of moral development is deeply rooted in Piaget's work. Piaget introduced a factor, the cognitive schema or system. According to Piaget, children construct their morality or moral reality much as they construct their physical reality, and organizing concepts as practical tools for interacting effectively with the world. Piaget is credited the role of socialization in developing moral ideologies and emotions. While tracing sequences of stages in the development of logical and scientific reasoning, however, Piaget only uncovered two somewhat cohesive systems of naturally developing moral thought. So the two phases developed by Piaget were the childhood heteronomous phase, which conditioned right and responsibility on concrete interest. It focused on conformity to approved social conventions as means of fulfilling them. Then the second phase, which is the adult or autonomous phase, showed a greater concern with doing the right thing within the framework of mutual purposes. This phase arose as children became critical and self-critical about their conventional moral beliefs and the social institutions supporting them. Also, as they began comparing different possible moral policies and practices with each other, intuiting the sorts of social purposes they need to serve. So Piaget described a two-stage process of moral development, while Kohlberg's theory of moral development outlined 6 stages within 3 different levels. So Kohlberg was determined to investigate whether there was much more detail and sophistication to the natural development of moral reasoning as given by Piaget, or there was something more to it. And he pursued this singular investigation until his death, some 35 years later. In drawing hundreds of colleagues into this empirical and educational mission across the globe, he virtually established moral development as a field. So now let's talk about movement through stages in Kohlberg's theory of moral development. Similar to many other theories in psychology, Kohlberg's theory of moral reasoning is also a stage theory. In other words, everyone goes through the stages sequentially without skipping any stage. However, movement through these stages are not natural. That is, people do not automatically move from one stage to other as they mature. In stage development, movement is affected when cognitive dissonance occurs. That is, when a person notices inadequacies in his or her present way of coping when a moral dilemma happens. So Kohlberg's theory is based on a study of 84 boys. In the interview, these boys or children are presented with a series of fictional stories in which the characters face moral dilemmas. The following is one of the most popular of the Kohlberg dilemmas. So the dilemma we will talk about today is the Heinz dilemma. Okay, so let's see what is Heinz dilemma. So in Europe, a woman who was near death from a special kind of cancer, there was only one drug that the doctors thought might save her. It was a form of radium, and the druggist was charging 10 times what the drug cost him to make. He paid $200 for the radium and charged $2,000 for a small dose of the drug. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow the money, but he could only get together $1,000, which is the half of what it cost. He told the druggist that his wife was dying and asked him to sell it cheaper or let him pay later, but the druggist said, "No, I discovered the drug and I'm going to make money from it." Therefore, Heinz got desperate and broke into the man's store to steal the drug for his wife. So this is the story of Heinz dilemma. So this story is one of the 11 Kohlberg devised to investigate the nature of moral thought. After reading the story, interviewees answer a series of questions about the moral dilemma. So the first question is, should Heinz have stolen the drug? Was stealing it right or wrong? And why? Would a good husband steal? Is it a husband's duty to steal the drug for his wife if he can get it in no other way? Did the druggist have the right to charge that much when there was no law setting a limit on the price, and why? Now that we know the Heinz dilemma, let's move to the levels in Kohlberg's theory. So the first level, or level 1, is premoral or preconventional morality. So this is prominent from ages 4 to 10. Here the emphasis is on external control. The standards are those of others, and they are observed either to avoid punishment or to reap rewards. These authority figures symbolize the moral values of the society. So since this level is found in children from ages 4 to 10, they follow the moral values as shown by their parents. The parents are the authority figure, and the children observe the moral values set by the parents either to avoid some kind of punishment or to get approval or to get some kind of reward. So during this period, a rudimentary sense of superego or conscience develops. The development of conscience is necessary for the formation of moral values. So this is a very important thing which happens from ages 4 to 10. So let's talk about stage 1 in level 1. So stage 1 is the punishment and obedience orientation. So in this particular stage, the main question or the main goal of the child or individual is, how can I avoid punishment? At the punishment and obedience orientation stage, the individual is responsive to cultural guidelines of good or bad and right or wrong, but primarily in terms of known related consequences. At this stage, children see rules as fixed and absolute. Obeying the rules is important because it is a means to avoid punishment, or the fear of punishment is likely to be the incentive for conformity. So as you can see, the concern in stage 1 is the concern for self. Will I get into trouble for doing or not doing something? Right or good behavior is associated with avoiding punishment. So if there was a child who was in stage 1 and he was told about Heinz dilemma, what would be the possible response depending on his moral development? The first response can be Heinz should not steal the drug because he might be caught and sent to jail. Because here the concern is for self and to avoid punishment. Heinz should steal the drug because if he doesn't, then his wife might scold him. So here the main goal is to avoid punishment and disapproval. So what are the moral inadequacies of stage 1 reasoning? So avoidance of punishment regardless of the ethical values of the action is unhealthy, especially under bad authorities. So here the problem arises when someone is in stage 1 and he's blindly conforming to the authorities who do not have a sense of moral value or who are bad. So, for example, in the year 1933 to 1945, Nazi soldiers persecuted Jews and other minorities. These soldiers either were carrying out orders under threat of punishment or had a misplaced trust in their leader, similar to a child who is from 4 to 10 years of age and who is in stage 1. Now, stage 2 in level 1. So stage 2 is called instrumental relativist orientation. So what's in it for me? The first question was, how can I avoid punishment? The second is, what's in it for me? What benefit do I get by following a certain set of moral values? Behaviors at the instrumental relativist orientation stage are guided by egocentrism and narcissistic needs. There is an intense desire to satisfy one's own need, but occasionally the needs of others are also considered. Reciprocity is possible at this point in moral development, but only if it serves one's own interest. The concern is, what's in it for me? Still egocentric in outlook, but with a growing ability to see things from other person's perspective. Action is judged right if it helps in satisfying one's needs or involves a fair exchange. So now if the Heinz dilemma was presented to someone who was in stage 2 of level 1 of moral development, what would be the possible responses? So there can be 2 responses. The first is, it is right for Heinz to steal the drug because it can cure his wife and then she can cook for him. The second response can be, the doctor scientist had spent lots of money and many years of his life to develop the cure. So it's not fair to him that Heinz stole the drug. Now, inadequacies of stage 2 reasoning. Heinz needs to have the drug to save his wife. Conflicts with the doctor scientist need to make a profit from his research. Now level 2, which is conventional morality. It is prominent from ages 10 to 13 years and into adulthood. Now the children want to please others. In the previous stage, they wanted to please themselves. Now they want to please others. They still observe the standards of others, but they have internalized these standards to some extent. Now they want to be considered good by those persons whose opinions are important to them. They are now able to take the roles of authority figures well enough to decide whether an action is good by their standards. Ultimately, children are able to distinguish between right and wrong without external control. Now, stage 3 in level 2, interpersonal concordance orientation. so often referred to as the good boy, good girl orientation. This stage of moral development is focused on living up to social expectations and roles. Approval and acceptance within one societal group provide the incentive to conform. So here the aim is to be accepted or approved by the society. In this age, the concern is what will people think of me? While in the first level, it was how can I avoid punishment? The desire is for group approval. Right action is the one that would please or impress others. This often involves self-sacrifice, but it provides the psychological pressure of approval of others. Actions are also judged in relation to their intention. Now, if somebody was in stage 3, what would be their response to Heinz dilemma? Again, there can be two responses. The first response is, yes, Heinz should steal the drug. He probably will go to jail for a short time for stealing, but his in-laws will think that he's a good husband. Social approval. The second is, the judge should not sentence Heinz to jail for stealing the drug because he meant well. He stole it to cure his wife. Stage 4 in level 2, law and order orientation. At this stage of moral development, there is a personal respect for authority. The focus is on maintaining law and order by following the rules, doing one's duty, and respecting authority. For example, I will do it because it is the law. So on contrast with the previous stage, here the concern goes beyond one's immediate group or groups to the larger society, to the maintenance of law and order. To put it simply, no one or group is above the law. So now if a person was in stage 4, his response to Heinz dilemma will be, as her husband, Heinz has a duty to save his wife's life, so he should steal the drug. But it's wrong to steal, so Heinz should be prepared to accept the penalty for breaking the law. The second response can be, the judge should sentence Heinz to jail. Stealing is against the law. He should not make any exceptions, even though Heinz's wife is dying. If the judge does not sentence Heinz to jail, then others may think it is right to steal and there will be chaos in the society. The inadequacies of stage 4 reasoning. So the first inadequacy is unquestioning obedience towards authority is unhealthy because authority can also be wrong at times. So Marshall Applewhite of Heaven's Gate asked his followers to commit suicide so as to shed their earthly bodies and depart in a UFO to higher plane of existence. The UFO was supposedly traveling behind the Hale-Bopp comet. In late March 1997, all 39 cult members obeyed and took their own lives in a mass suicide. So this happened because they had unquestioning obedience towards authority. Accepted social order may not be the best possible order. The laws of society may even be bad. For example, Hitler introduced a decree suspending the basic rights of citizens and imposing the death sentence for resistance to the decree and disturbances to public order. Let's move on to level 3. So level 3 is post-conventional, autonomous, or principled morality, and this can occur from adolescence onwards. So level 1 was from year 4 to 10. Level 2 was from year 10 to 13, which could extend into adulthood, and level 3 can occur from adolescence onwards. So this level marks the attainment of true morality. The person acknowledges the possibility of conflict between two socially accepted standards and tries to decide between them. The control of conduct is now internal, both in the standards observed and in the reasoning about right and wrong. Moral development in adolescence coordinates with the establishment of abstract thinking. Adolescents will challenge, test, and perhaps even reject social, moral, and religious norms under which they have been raised. Stage 5 in level 3. The stage 5 is called social contract legalistic orientation. So individuals who reach this stage have developed a system of values and principles that determine for them what is right or wrong. Behaviors are acceptably guided by this value system, provided they do not violate the human rights and they live according to the universal laws and principles. However, they hold the idea that the laws are subject to scrutiny and change as needs within society evolve and change. For example, I will do it because it is the moral and legal thing to do, even though that is not my personal choice. At this stage, people begin to account for the different values, opinions, and beliefs of other people. Social rules are not the sole basis for discussions or decisions and behaviors because the person believes a higher moral principle applies, such as equality and justice. Here, the concern is social utility or public interest. While rules are needed to maintain social order, they should not be blindly obeyed, but should be even changed by social contract for the greater good of society. Right action is one that protects the rights of the individual according to rules agreed upon by the whole society. So now if someone was in stage 5, what will be his or her response to Heinz dilemma? Heinz should steal the drug because everyone has the right to life regardless of the law against stealing. Should Heinz be caught and persecuted for stealing, then the law needs to be reinterpreted because a person's life is at stake. The inadequacies of stage 5 reasoning. So how do we arrive at a consensus on the rules that are good for society? Should a majority group impose their preferences on a minority group? What if you disagree with the decision of the majority? Would you disobey their rules? So the last stage in Kohlberg's theory is universal ethical principle orientation. Kohlberg's final level of moral reasoning is based upon internalized principles of honor, justice, and respect for human dignity. Laws are abstract and unwritten, such as golden rule, quality of human rights, and justice for all. They are not concrete rules established by the society. The conscience is the guide when one fails to meet the self-expected behaviors. The personal conscience is intense guilt. The conformity to these ethical principles is so strong that the individual will stand by them even knowing that negative consequences will result. For example, I will do it because I believe it is the right thing to do, even though it is illegal, and I will be imprisoned for doing this. Here, the concern is for moral principles. An action is judged right if it is consistent with self-chosen ethical principles. These principles are not concrete moral rules, but are universal principles of justice, reciprocity, equality, and human dignity. So possible stage 6 response to Heinz dilemma. Heinz should steal the drug to save his wife because preserving human life is a higher moral obligation than preserving property. So inadequacy of stage 6 reasoning. Our conscience is not an infallible guide to behavior because it works according to the principles we have adopted. Moreover, who or what determines these universal principles? So Kohlberg's conception of justice follows that of great moral leaders such as Gandhi and Martin Luther King. According to these people, the principles of justice require us to treat the claims of all parties in an impartial manner, respecting the basic dignity of all people as individuals. The principles of justice are therefore universal. They apply to all. Thus, for example, we would not vote for a law that aids some people but hurts others. The principles of justice guide us toward decisions based on an equal respect for all. Further stages. In Kohlberg's empirical studies of individuals throughout their life, Kohlberg observed that some had apparently undergone moral stage regression. This could be resolved either by allowing for moral regression or by extending the theory. So Kohlberg thus postulated the existence of substages in which the emerging stage has not yet been fully integrated into the personality. In particular, Kohlberg noted a stage of 4.5 or a 4 plus, a transition from stage 4 to stage 5, that shared characteristics of both. Kohlberg suggested that there might be a seventh stage, transcendental morality or morality of cosmic orientation, which linked religion with moral reasoning. Kohlberg thus believed that children's moral orientation unfolds as a consequence of their cognitive development. Children construct their moral thoughts as they pass from one stage to other, rather than passively accepting a cultural norm of morality. He believed that whereas adults characteristically impose rules and regulations on children, the mutual give and take in peer interaction provides children with an opportunity to make the perspective of another person and to generate rules democratically. Criticisms of the theory. Hogan feels that it is dangerous for people to place their own principles above laws and society. Others have argued that Kohlberg's stages are culturally biased. Researchers find that villagers or individuals raised in Eastern philosophies stop at a stage 3, but perhaps they continue to develop moralities in directions that Kohlberg's stages fail to capture. Another criticism is that Kohlberg's theory is gender biased, a view expressed by Carol Gilligan. She observed that Kohlberg's stages were derived exclusively from interviews with males and the stages reflect a decidedly male orientation. For males, advanced moral thought revolves around rules and rights and abstract principle. For women, morality centers not on rights and rules but on interpersonal relationships and the ethics of compassion and care. That is, they no longer consider their responsibilities in terms of what is conventionally expected of them, but in terms of their own insight into ethics of care and responsibility. The question is, does moral reasoning necessarily lead to moral behavior? Kohlberg's theory is concerned with moral thinking, but there is a big difference between knowing what we ought to do versus our actual actions. People who can talk at high moral level may not behave accordingly. Consequently, we would not expect perfect correlation between moral judgment and moral action. In addition, Kohlberg and his co-workers have obtained quantitative estimates of the extent to which subjects respond in terms of one particular stage. Some subjects might be in transition between stages. One does not expect perfect consistency. Most of Kohlberg's theory focus on the family and authority. However, one researcher invited adolescents to write stories about their own moral dilemmas that were broader in scope, focusing on friend, acquaintances, and other issues as well as family and authority. Most of Kohlberg's evidence on his stage sequence comes from cross-sectional data. In cross-sectional study, different children are interviewed at each stage, so there is no guarantee that any individual child actually moves through the stages in order. For example, there is no guarantee that a boy who is coded at stage 3 at the age 13 actually passed through stages 1 and 2 in order when he was younger. More conclusive evidence comes from longitudinal studies in which the same children are followed over time. Some developmentalists fault the quality of Kohlberg's research and believe that more attention should be paid to the way moral development is assessed. For example, James argued that alternative methods should be used to collect information about moral thinking instead of relying on a single method. Researchers have also found that the hypothetical moral dilemmas posed in Kohlberg's theory do not match the moral dilemmas many children and adults face in their everyday lives. Even though Kohlberg's theory was criticized in a lot of ways, especially based on the research design that Kohlberg used, there are a lot of applications of this theory. So Lawrence Kohlberg devised a moral education program in the 1960s based on his cognitive development theory. Called the Just Community Program, just communities were school environments in which students were encouraged and supported to form relationships of basic trust and respect with one another, and these school communities provided students with the opportunity to be self-governed and encouraged a democratic form of government within each community. Exposure to moral questions and the opportunity to practice moral behavior in a supportive community appear to foster deeper moral reasoning and more constructive behavior. Kohlberg's first just community was the cluster school upon which he modeled subsequent communities. Just community programs have been established in schools, prisons, and other institutions with a fair amount of success. The Defining Issues Test, or the DIT, is a component model of moral development devised by James Rest in 1979. The DIT uses a Likert type scale to give quantitative rankings to 5 moral dilemmas, the data of which are then analyzed. The analysis of this data reveals information about 3 schemas of moral reasoning: the personal interest schema, the maintaining norms schema, and the post-conventional schema. One of the test's original purposes was to assess the transition of moral development from adolescence to adulthood. Kohlberg used these findings to reject traditional character education practices. These approaches are premised in the idea that moral character is comprised of a bag of virtues, such as honesty, kindness, patience, strength, etc. According to the traditional approach, teachers are to teach these virtues through example and direct communication by giving students an opportunity to practice these virtues and by rewarding their expression. In fact, teachers often end up arbitrarily imposing certain values depending upon their societal, cultural, and personal beliefs. In order to address this issue of ethical relativity, some have adopted the value clarification approach to moral education. This teaching practice is based on the assumption that there are no single correct answers to ethical dilemmas, but that there is a value in holding clear views and acting accordingly. In 1966, Turiel found that when children listened to adults' moral judgments, the resulting change was slight. This is what Kohlberg might have expected, for he believes that if children are to reorganize their thinking, they must be more active. Accordingly, Kohlberg encouraged another student, Blatt, to lead discussion groups in which children had a chance to participate actively with moral issues. Blatt presented moral dilemmas which engaged the class in a good deal of heated debate. He tried to leave much of the discussion to the children themselves, stepping in only to summarize, clarify, and sometimes present a view himself. He encouraged arguments that were one stage above those of most of the class. In essence, he tried to implement one of Kohlberg's main ideas on how children move through the stages. They do so by encountering views which challenge their thinking and stimulate them to formulate better arguments. Let's see the implications of Kohlberg's theory of moral development in the field of nursing. So nursing itself by nature is a moral endeavor. Literature in the field has long reflected an interest in the moral development of nurses and how ethical decisions are made. With the growing complexities of healthcare, the need and importance of moral development in nursing and nursing ethics is becoming increasingly apparent. Nurses are faced with moral and ethical judgments on a daily basis. Some of the most common issues faced by nurses today include confidentiality, use of restraints, trust, refusing care, genetics, and the end-of-life concerns. Thus, understanding the role of the nurse in ethical decision will assist nurses in articulating their ethical positions and in developing the skills needed to make ethical decisions. Nurses need to know their own moral reasoning level. Recognizing one's own moral developmental level is essential in separating one's own beliefs from others when helping clients with their moral decision-making process. Nurses should also recognize the level of moral reasoning used by members of the healthcare team and its influence on the client's care plan. This can be exemplified in the following scenario. The nurse is caring for a homeless person and believes that all clients deserve the same level of care. The case manager, being responsible for resource allocation, complains about the client's length of stay and the amount of resources being expended on this one client. The nurse and the case manager are in conflict because of their different levels of moral decision making within their practices. So it is thought that with the help of formal education and training, the nurse is not only provided with the necessary skills, but can also effectively participate in the ethical decision-making process. Moral development has relevance to psychiatric nursing in that it affects critical thinking about how individuals ought to behave and treat others. Moral behavior reflects the way a person interprets basic respect for other persons, such as the respect for other persons, for human life, freedom, justice, or confidentiality. Psychiatric nurses must be able to assess the level of moral development of their clients in order to be able to help them in their effort to advance in their progression towards a higher level of developmental maturity. In the level 1, that is the pre-conventional level, it is at this level that children may view illness as a punishment for fighting with siblings or disobeying their parents. The nurse must be aware of this thinking and reinforce teaching that the child cannot become ill because of wrongdoing. One might expect that juvenile delinquents or criminals would typically reason at stages 1 or 2, viewing morality as something imposed from without or as a matter of self-interest, rather than identifying with society's conventional expectations. In level 2, conventional level, nurses may observe this when family members make end-of-life decisions for their loved ones. Individual members often struggle with this type of dilemma. Grief support will involve an understanding of the level of moral decision-making of each family member. In level 3, post-conventional level, nurses should recognize the level of moral development. It has been found that there is a strong post-conventional thinking in the individuals participating in a protest than the non-participants. This is because there is some relationship between moral thought and action. So knowledge of the appropriateness of behavior at each developmental level is vital to the planning and implementation of quality nursing care. Through techniques like modeling, clarification, explanation, and validation, the nurses can contribute to the client's moral development. Kohlberg also believed that certain types of parent-child experiences could induce the child to think at a more advanced level of moral thinking. In particular, parents who allow or encourage conversation about value-laden issues promote more advanced moral thought in their children. Also, either through their poor treatment of the child or their own lacking of superego functioning, they compromise the child's capacity to develop a strong and healthy superego. There is an increasing emphasis on the role of parenting in moral development, which can be educated by nurses. Kohlberg thus maintains that his stages are not only the product of socialization, that is, socializing agents, for example, parents and teachers, do not directly teach new forms of thinking. The stages emerge instead from our own thinking about moral problems. Social experiences do promote development, but they do so by stimulating our mental processes. As we get into discussions and debates with others, we find our views questioned and challenged and are therefore motivated to come up with new, more comprehensive positions. New stages reflect these broader viewpoints. Kohlberg says that his stages are not the product of maturation. That is, the stage structures and the sequences do not simply unfold according to a genetic blueprint. Summary: Lawrence Kohlberg integrated Piaget's concepts and described three major levels of morality. The first level is pre-conventional morality, in which punishment and obedience to the parent are the determining factors. The second level is the morality of conventional role conformity, in which children try to conform to gain approval and to maintain good relationships with others. The third and the highest level is the morality of self-accepted moral principles, in which children voluntarily comply with rules based on a concept of ethical principles and make exceptions to rules in certain circumstances. Kohlberg's theory of moral development has not gone unchallenged, but in spite of all criticisms, these are important guidelines for understanding human processes that can allow nurses to predict human responses and recognize deviation from the norm. So moral development is a major topic of interest in both psychology and education. One of the best known theories was developed by Lawrence Kohlberg, who formulated the development of moral reasoning. Nevertheless, whatever criticisms and questions we might have, there is no doubt that Kohlberg's accomplishment is great. Kohlberg has nonetheless provided us with a challenging vision of what development might be. Thus, Kohlberg's theory of moral development appears to be an acceptable model that adds value to the ethical practice of nursing and asserts that nurses will look at ethical dilemmas and intervene based on their individual stage.